In the 2 months since the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine began, Russia has nearly doubled its revenue in fossil fuel exports to the European Union, raking in some 62 billion euro thanks to soaring gas and oil prices. Just today, however, Russia cut off natural gas exports to Poland and Bulgaria and threatened to do the same to other NATO members in a move condemned by European leaders as blackmail. The EU relies on Russia for about 40% of its natural gas imports.
Joining us now to discuss is Brittany Ramos Debarros. She's a congressional candidate for New York's 11th District, organizing director of About Face, Veterans Against the War, and an Afghanistan veteran. Welcome back to Rising. So glad to have you with us in studio.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you with us. So obviously, tell us what you're thinking right now about what's going on in Ukraine. It's terrible, obviously, the situation there and the death and destruction. We are, though, concerned simultaneously about some expanding, ever-broadening war, or proxy war turning into an actual war with Russia. What are your thoughts about the conflict at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I always try to start with the human element, which is remembering that this is already a full-blown war for Ukrainians who are suffering under these aggressive attacks that are unjustifiable. I think we've all said that for several weeks now as we've watched this horrific situation unfold. But when we dig deeper, I find myself frustrated as a former Army captain and a person who has been in war with the fact that we find ourselves with such limited resources and such limited recourse. We have only invested in one tool for national security for decades, if not longer, and that is military force projection as a strategy to keep ourselves safe. This is a situation that is demonstrating that in a multipolar world, that is not sufficient. We have to invest in diplomacy, in cooperative efforts, in other tools that allow us to have recourse in situations when nation states and when, rogue actors like Putin are, disregarding human life, disregarding what's good for the rest of the world. And that's why we talk, on my platform, we talk about security in conjunction with climate. And a lot of people ask us why. They think that those things don't go together, but it's because of a situation exactly like this. Russia is a petrostate. It is allowed and able to fuel its war right now because of our reliance on fossil fuels and global reliance on fossil fuels. And we need a Green New Deal, and we need to start transitioning to other forms of energy, to other policies that allow us to move into a more renewable energy economy, so that we can not only make sure that we address climate change and climate crisis, more aptly put, but that we can address the petrostates like Russia and others who are allowed to feed off of that dependence.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was back in 2016, Bernie said something similar when asked about what the biggest national security threat to the country was, and he said something about climate change, and they tried to laugh him out of the room. But you're right, this exact situation is what people are concerned about. It is interesting, as we mentioned in the read, that although there has been a great deal of enthusiasm for sanctions against Russia as a tool outside of direct military conflict to have, political influence, the idea that Russia is now using and restricting its own oil exports in a similar sort of way is considered to be blackmail. I'm curious, how does all of this play in the context of your congressional race, both the kind of environmental piece of it and the kind of military piece of it? I know that you are running in a race against another Democrat who is also a veteran. Staten Island is one of the more conservative parts of New York City. How does all of this, both the environmental piece and the kind of military interventionist piece, play in your local politics?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Staten Island is really misunderstood. It is definitely, it has more of a conservative streak than the rest of New York City, certainly, not trying to minimize that. But what we also have is an unusually high percentage of unaffiliated active voters. And we have really low turnout. In the 2018 congressional primary, we had about 11% turnout rounding up. 11% rounding up. And so what we see is actually the majority of Staten Islanders and, parts of New York 11 have really checked out of the process. And when you talk to them, when I was knocking doors in 2018, what I heard the most was, why bother? Nothing in my life ever changes. These people come around when they're campaigning and then I never hear from them again. They don't really care about us, both parties, right? And so we see a real anti-establishment disillusionment with the elitism and disconnectedness of both political parties. And who can be surprised, right? I am the only person in my race right now, Republican or Democrat, who's not a millionaire, who's a working class person who has actually understood what it feels like to figure out how to pay your rent, to figure out how to pay for food, who has received notices threatening to kick you out of your home, right? When I was growing up and my parents were working multiple jobs. And so that's something that's not really red or blue. It's not really left or right. As Reverend Barber says on the Poor People's Campaign, it's really about top versus bottom, and it's about right versus wrong. And, you know, everywhere from the reliance on petroleum and fossil fuels to the corruption of the fossil fuel industry and all of the corporations that pour money, special interests, big real estate, right? All of these have environmental impacts that also translate to economic and health impacts for our community, and our communities recognize that. Just now they cut down acres and acres and acres of trees in our only natural wetland in Staten Island. Staten Island floods every time there's a storm. We literally just had Superstorm Ida where people died because it was so catastrophic. We've had unprecedented numbers of billion-dollar damage storms in the last year in the United States alone. And Staten Island and Brooklyn are on the front lines of that. And not only have they not in the last several years, despite their promises, including Max Rose's promises, built up infrastructure appropriately to match what we're up against, but they've allowed developers to purchase and destroy the wetlands that are our one natural protection.
Yeah.
And so, you know, to me, that is deeply connected to what we're seeing overseas. You can't separate these issues because it all comes back to why can't we get policies passed that the majority of my district, the majority of the American public want? Medicare for all, a Green New Deal, canceling student debt. Why can't we get those passed? Because we have politicians who are more loyal to corporate interests and to the multimillionaires and 1% than they are to everyday people who are facing layered crises right now and need a government that works for them.
And what do the people in your district think about, you know, the Ukraine situation specifically? Because what I think I hear from a lot of people is obviously tremendous sympathy, a desire to help, but then when you hear like out-of-touch Hollywood elite type people say, "Oh yeah, I'll pay $77 in gas for if it helps Ukraine," and like, but working people can't do that. They might want what's best for Ukraine, but they cannot stomach that suffering here, and that's not unreasonable to be concerned about that. So do you hear that sentiment in the people you want to represent?
Absolutely. I mean, we have working families that are facing eviction as the eviction moratorium expired, still don't have good cause protections, which we need to pass at both the New York State and federal level. That's something I would fight for in Congress, not to mention the health impacts and environmental impacts that we've talked about. And now they're facing growing prices. Of course, people are freaking out, I mean, that is a lot for working families. That's why. And they shouldn't have to stomach the cost of that. I'm really sick of millionaires making policies without really considering working class or working poor often Americans. There's precedent for creating price caps for gasoline and other essential goods that would shield the American public and working families in my district and across the country, and make sure that we're able to institute this, whatever sanctions or actions we need to take in order to do our best to curb Russia's aggression, but making sure that working families in the United States are not bearing the brunt of that. I put out a call for those price caps, I think over a month ago at this point. Unfortunately, others in my race have not joined me in that, but that is a very simple, well-precedented, temporary support for working families to make sure that they can continue to get by in the midst of, these hopefully what is a movement towards de-escalation and not full-blown world war.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll continue this conversation in just a minute.